There's sort of two different zones or two different areas you can think about in a lake as opposed to whether you're close to the shore or out in the middle. So if you're in the littoral zone, that means you're close to the shore. If you're out in the middle, you're in the limnitic zone, right? Y'all know what a limnologist studies? If you took a class, you can take a whole class, like at San Francisco State, they offer a class on limnology. What do you study? Lakes. And people who spend their whole life specialized on just lakes. Yeah. So limnitic would be sort of the open part of the lake. You'll notice also with the strata, you have like the photic zone. That would be where light penetrates. Light can only penetrate to a relatively short depth, right? So you have this major part of even a lake called the aphotic zone. Obviously things that are photosynthetic are going to be limited to being in this part. And I might as well point out there's a little issue here because if you're photosynthetic, you need light, but you also need nutrients, things like nitrogen and phosphorus. And where do you think most of the nutrients are in a lake? On the bottom. So that kind of creates a problem, right? You're photosynthetic, you want to have nitrogen and phosphorus, and yet those nutrients are mostly towards the bottom, and yet you have to stay up towards the top. So we'll talk about how that works. That's obviously a little bit of an issue, right? And then you have also these different, so you have like a pelagic zone, that would be like the free swimming zone, and then you have a benthic zone, those would be things on the bottom. And you could really almost think of each one of these as being a different life zone. And if you were to look at this in an ocean, it looks similar in some ways. Now we're calling that littoral zone the neritic zone, right? The oceanic zone, we're not calling the limnitic zone because it's not a lake, right? We're calling it the oceanic zone. But there's still a photic zone. Light still is only going to penetrate a certain distance, right? And this huge aphotic zone. We have a pelagic zone where things are out swimming around, and a benthic zone. Because you have really, really deep parts of oceans, you can even talk about something like an abyssal zone, right? Where you're really, really deep. And then, of course, there's a whole assemblage of organisms that live like around hydrothermal vents and stuff on the seafloors and under tremendous pressure, no light, very, very cold temperatures, except with the exception of the geothermal energy that's coming through. You have this continental shelf here, so you have things that I would typically call as being, I would actually refer to that neritic zone as being subtidal, right? And then you'll notice above that you have the intertidal because you have this major area right along the shoreline that's partially covered over with water during the day and then partially exposed, right? So you've got all of this wave action and you have this sort of really extreme environment, but that is extremely productive in certain systems. There are lots of organisms that occupy intertidal regions, especially in temperate areas, and they can be very productive, very important regions. Okay. And just to kind of point out different types of adaptations, so you know if you go underwater, which you all recognize this as an absorption spectrum, right, for a bunch of different plant pigments. You all realize that light's an electromagnetic wave, right? And so if the wavelength is smaller, that means the frequency is, it's a relationship between wavelength and frequency. They're inversely related, right? So the smaller the wavelength, the higher the frequency. So these would be like violet or blue. If you keep getting smaller wavelength, higher frequency, here you'd have like ultraviolet, then you'd have like X-rays, gamma rays, and stuff would be the really high penetrating wavelengths, right? Over here you have red. You realize these are the only wavelengths of electromagnetic radiation that your eyes are sensitive to, so you can't, that's why you don't see ultraviolet rays bouncing around in the room, right? Here you'd have like, if you get bigger, lower frequency, bigger wavelength, lower frequency, you'd have like infrared, and then you'd have like microwaves, radio waves, and stuff like that would be on this end, right? So you'll notice that plants are specialized to absorb particular types of wavelengths for particular parts of the visible spectrum. So if you look at plants that would have chlorophyll A and B, those would be things that would be, what color? Green, right? Remember chlorophyll B is the secondary pigment you associate with chlorophyte, with green algae and terrestrial plants, right? They absorb blue really well, and they also absorb red pretty well, right? If you go to an intertidal area, the green algae, things like ulva and enteromorpha, they tend to be high intertidal. They're exposed a lot. Out in the bright sunshine, they're absorbing across this sort of broader spectrum. Red algae, which have a lot of these phycoerythrins and carotenoids, tend to be subtidal. They tend to be much lower. Browns can kind of be across, but those tend to be much lower. What wavelength is getting underwater the best? When you go underwater, what color does it look? When you go underwater, does it look red? Does it look yellow? What color does it look? Have you ever gone underwater? You're scuba diving around looking underwater? Crying out loud, what color does it look?
Blue.
It looks blue, right? The higher frequency wavelengths are the ones that penetrate the best, right? So if you look, for example, at red algae that have like a lot of these phytoerythrins, what are they absorbing? Well, they're absorbing what colors? Blues and greens. They don't absorb reds very well at all. But that makes sense, right? Because they live in a habitat where they need to be able to absorb mostly blues and greens, and they absorb those really quite well. Yeah, no, maybe. Where I finished the other groups. We'll see if I can finish this. I always mess this up for some reason. So we were talking about nutrients being on the bottom. They need to get to the top. And so we have this thing called thermal inversion, or upwelling is the other name for this. So you can imagine we have a lake here. In the wintertime, it's actually colder at the top than it is at the bottom. This is because of a very unusual property that water has, and that is that as it transitions from a liquid to a solid, it becomes less dense. That's unusual, you realize. Most compounds, as they go from liquid to solid, they become more dense, such that ice really should sink, but it doesn't. It floats. That's weird. I know it doesn't seem weird to you because water's everywhere. That's an unusual property for something to have. A lot of people have argued that life could not exist were it not for that unusual property of water, because when life would have started, if lakes froze from the bottom up, everything would have been killed. And you would not be able to actually have life continue overwintering if you didn't have liquid water down below where it could live. So a lake is actually colder on top than the bottom in the winter because of this unusual process of property of water. You can imagine now in the spring everything starts to warm up. You have more of an equalization of temperatures, and then you have some surface winds that basically allow sediments that are on the bottom to be brought to the top, such that the photosynthetic organisms actually have the nutrients that they would need in order to be able to survive. In the summertime, the thermocline is actually reversed, where you have the surface temperatures are warmer and the deep temperatures are colder. And then in the autumn you have sort of a reverse again of the thermocline and more upwelling. Upwelling is very important. If you hear about like red tides, at least in California, they're almost always caused by upwelling. You have these cold nutrient-rich waters that are brought to the surface. The algae go berserk because it's the only limiting factor that they have. They've got tons of light, tons of water. They're ready to go all the time. There should be just one giant red tide all the time. What's limiting is the nitrogen and phosphorus, which are in sediments in the bottom, and as soon as you bring those to the surface, they take off. Okay, so we're going to start going through the biomes, but we'll do that next time. And I'm going to go clickety-click through the biomes and then start getting through the population.